1955. A CIA agent, his hands shaking, picks up a photograph. Tiny bead of sweat drips off his chin. He carefully turns it over to see it's marked 1954. Next to the date, the words Adolf Schuttelmeyer are written. The other man in the photo, Philip Citroen, who says he's a former German SS trooper, has told the CIA agent that he and Adolf Hitler had that photograph taken in Argentina. Could that be true? You tell us after you finish watching the show. Day 0, April 30th, 1945. Hitler and his new wife Eva Braun are sitting in the Führerbunker in Berlin, listening to the sounds of Soviet shells exploding in the distance. Allied forces have bombed the hell out of Berlin. Much of the city is filled with acrid smoke, and the smell of death and decay is everywhere. Hitler has known for a while that the gig is up, but one thing that scares him more than death is his body being paraded around like a prize pig. That's what mobs in Italy just did to Benito Mussolini after they executed him at the Piazzale Loreto. Crowds spat on and kicked the corpse, tore the skin of his face, and strung him up like cattle at a slaughterhouse. There's no way Hitler will allow himself to be treated like that. At approximately 2:30 a.m., Hitler says his farewells to the people still in the bunker, about 20 in total, many of them women. Every so often he flinched when he heard an explosion, the Soviets now being about half a kilometer away. At some point that day, Hitler's private pilot, Hans Bauer, told his boss that he had a plane ready and it could take him anywhere he wanted, to Argentina, Japan, Greenland, Manchuria, but Hitler said no, he was not up for a life on the run. In the afternoon, outside Hitler's sleeping quarters, the smell of burned almonds fills the air. Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, enters the room. He saw Adolf and Eva slumped on the couch. When the SS Sturmbannführer Otto Gunsche entered, blood dripped down Adolf's arm, forming a pool in the rug below. This scene will be the subject of debate for years to come. Gunsche broke the news to the others, although everyone knew this would happen. Both Hitlers were rolled into rugs, taken upstairs through an emergency exit, and placed in the Reich Chancellery garden. It was a painful time for Linge, whose eyes filled with tears when his Führer's face stuck out of the rug and seemed to look at him. How had this happened to his great leader, to Germany? A few people were there to watch the ensuing spectacle, including Hitler's propaganda merchant Joseph Goebbels, who just a couple of months before was screaming down the German radio for young folks to fight. We werewolves consider it our supreme duty to kill, and to kill, employing every cunning and vile in the darkness of the night, crawling, groping through towns and villages like wolves, noiselessly, mysteriously. He lost the plot, and now his madness was about to hit a crescendo. Setting the Führer's body on fire was something he never imagined could happen. He was distraught, a beaten man. He and the others in attendance, mostly SS, doused the Hitler's bodies in gasoline. Gunsche threw a burning rag on the bodies, and it was soon evident that more gasoline would be needed. Thankfully, a car nearby provided it. Martin Bormann, head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, piled on extra paper and wood. The flames rose into the air as the smell of burning flesh and the rug filled the nostrils of the 8 or 9 men in attendance, each giving their boss one last salute. The question is, how many will live to tell the tale about what happened in that garden? Sometime later, that bloodied rug in Hitler's quarters was also burned in the garden. It too will be speculated over for decades to come. As the Red Army drew closer to that bunker, the remaining Nazi officers did everything they could to ensure nothing was left of Hitler. From around 4 to 6:30 p.m., they poured more and more gasoline on the remains. To properly cremate bodies, you generally need a very high temperature, but this incessant returning to the bodies reduced Adolf and Eva to a pile of bones and ashes. It was a job well done, or at least that's what some people think. Day 1. At about 9:30 in the morning, the German people heard something disturbing on a radio station based in Hamburg. They were forewarned that a grave and important announcement would soon be made. The radio station proceeded to play Wagner's operas, Hitler's music of choice, especially when he was raging with power lust. At 10:20 p.m., the commander-in-chief for the north of Germany, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, told listeners that Hitler had died a brave man fighting at the head of his troops. Being cooked like a goose in the garden was hardly in line with Germany's propaganda. Talking about propaganda, after Hitler's body had been nuked, Goebbels wandered around the bunker going into the garden, hoping a Red Army soldier would shoot him. He tried to arrange a ceasefire, but the Russians were having none of it. Goebbels was done. He saw no point in living any longer. One of the last people to see Goebbels was Hans-Erich Voss, who asked him why he hadn't fled like the others. Goebbels, looking utterly downcast, told him the captain must not leave his sinking ship. I had thought about it all and decided to stay here. I have nowhere to go because with little children I would not be able to make it. He was at least true to his word. He knew other high-ranking Nazis would likely escape Germany, but he wasn't going anywhere. That day, Goebbels got an SS dentist to give a big shot of morphine to his 6 kids. He and his wife Magda, like Hitler and Eva, ended up in the Chancellery Garden, except the cremation job on them was shoddy. The Russians later got their hands on bits that were left. Word spread around the world about Hitler, but not everyone was convinced he was dead. Notably, the tyrant at the head of the Soviet Union, Joseph Man of Steel Stalin. You'll hear more on him soon. Day 2. In light of what Hitler had done, in view of the war and him massacring millions of Jews and others that he deemed biologically inferior, you'd think the obituaries that were published after his death would not have exactly been complimentary. Think again. Knut Hamsun, who was a Norwegian Nobel Prize-winning novelist, showered the dead Führer in post-mortem adoration. He wrote, Hitler was a warrior for humankind, and a preacher of the gospel of justice for all nations. He was a reforming character of the highest order. Well, we guess Hitler did literally reform the world, but in an entirely negative way. Hamsun was well out of his mind, but not everyone rejoiced about Hitler's passing. In a long obituary in the New York Times, Hitler was condemned for his views on the Aryan race. The obituary talked about his frustration of not becoming a working artist and said Hitler was evil for his secret murder of opponents and those suspected of opposition, and the ruthless destruction of the Jews. The article mentioned he was a vegetarian, that he hardly ever slept, had few women friends, and had a passion for neatness. The writer was probably not aware of Hitler's addictions and what high doses of methamphetamine can do to a person. The Daily Express in England wrote, Germans put out the news everyone hopes is true. Boston's Daily Record printed in bold, "Will rant no more." Another U.S. paper said, American troops speeding across Austria, peace by week's end hinted by Churchill. The Salt Lake Tribune was one of the newspapers that expressed what was on a lot of people's minds. Hitler couldn't afford to accept unconditional surrender, so what may prove to be the legend of his meeting a hero's death had to be staged. I still cannot escape the feeling that Hitler is someplace where nobody expects him to be. But people felt more assured when they saw the front cover of Time magazine and its big X. On this day, it's believed that Martin Bormann died, likely killed by the Red Army, but this was only confirmed in 1973, and his body wasn't positively identified until 1998. He didn't get away, that's for sure, like some of the other Nazi criminals we'll discuss soon. Day 3. Stalin, a murderer of millions himself, was in no mood to celebrate. Just after he'd heard the news, unlike others who jumped for joy, he was somber. All he said was, "So the bastard's dead. Too bad we didn't catch him alive." Day 4. Even though Hitler was dead and the Germans had certainly lost the war, fighting carried on. There was still much work to do. In his will, Hitler named Admiral Karl Donitz as the heir and president of Germany. Talk about a poop sandwich of a job. Donitz was really surprised he'd been named, as were some other Nazis who said, "Who the hell is this Donitz guy?" He later said the likely reason he'd been chosen was that Hitler had believed only a reasonable man with an honest reputation as a sailor could make a decent peace. Donitz tried negotiating peace with the US and the UK, but he was under no illusion that the Soviets would be making any deals. They wanted blood and the spoils of Germany, which is not surprising given that the Soviet Union had seen about 24 million civilian and military deaths during the war. Stalin was still furious and very skeptical about Hitler's death. He was also naturally suspicious about the intentions of the US and the UK. When he does find out more about Hitler's death, he won't be in the mood to share that information. Day 5. American General Dwight Eisenhower and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery were not in agreement with the kind of surrender that Donitz wanted. They wanted unconditional surrender from Germany, all its forces everywhere, and they wanted to ensure that the country would be demilitarized. They had good reason not to trust Germany, so the German forces kept on fighting. Donitz also told his men to do what Hitler had written and destroy as much German infrastructure as possible. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers looted German houses and killed civilians. US, UK, and French forces won't reach Berlin until July. They'll also let loose years of anger. It was around this time that one of the most infamous Nazis surrendered. The one-time flying ace and one of Hitler's most treasured men, Hermann Wilhelm Göring. We'll come back to his fate later. Day 8. Only now did Donitz agree to a German surrender on all fronts. It was better to do that than leave Germany's soldiers to face the music in Soviet captivity. Stalin asked for another signing ceremony, and that came a day after. World War II wasn't over, but the Germans were now completely finished. Donitz didn't take the easy way out. He spent about 10 years in prison and went on to live until he was 89. Day 10. Stalin was paranoid. He knew that some of the Nazis were escaping from Germany. Like the UK and the US, Stalin wanted the Nazis for himself. He wanted their intelligence. He wanted to hurt them, to torture them. He wanted their scientific data, but most of all, he wanted Hitler. The thought of Hitler living it up in South America trying to create a Fourth Reich and come back at Russia kept Stalin awake at night. He was determined to find out the truth. He was also wary of the British and Americans telling his inner circle the capitalist encirclement continues. Day 23. In the meantime, Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's chief of the German police and one of the most powerful Nazis of them all, was captured by the British. Nazis were scarpering like mice from a house fire when, at a checkpoint in Bremervörde, northern Germany, two men wearing long green overcoats and another man wandered by, one of them wearing an eye patch. The man said he was a low-ranking soldier named Heinrich Heisinger. It was too bad for him the Brits had seen fake papers like this before. The guy argued for a bit, and when he realized the game was up, he took off the eye patch to reveal his normal-looking eye. He then said his name was Heinrich Himmler, and it didn't take long for the Brits to understand that the man in their custody was important. He was, after all, the architect of the Holocaust. Since Goebbels was gone and Hermann Göring was already in custody, this guy in British hands was a coup. He was arguably the most wanted Nazi of them all. The celebrations didn't last long. Himmler died soon after swallowing a secret cyanide pill. Month 1. Around this time, Stalin was asked if Hitler was alive, to which he announced that the German leader was likely living in Spain or Argentina. He was adamant. Every time he said anything about the very much alive Hitler, American newspapers picked it up, and the public lapped it up. Soon, 70% of Americans said they thought the Führer's heart was still beating and he was sunning it up in South America. The British public, for the most part, was also suspicious. Month 2. With Stalin so unsure that Hitler was dead, he had his men search high and low for Hitler's dentist. The problem for Stalin was that Hitler's main dentist, the man who'd helped send Goebbels' kids deep into the arms of Morpheus, Hugo Blaschke, had done what any endodontist for war criminals would have done and tried to escape. He didn't get far. The Americans arrested him in Austria, after which he spent a few years in prison. Stalin was miffed about this, but his men investigated further and discovered that Blaschke had an assistant named Käthe Hussermann. They were told she was currently in Berlin in her apartment living as if nothing had happened. They were told that she had ample experience treating the Führer's choppers, and no sooner than you could say gulag, Stalin's men were dragging this woman from her apartment. She was immediately taken to a place where someone showed her a bunch of teeth. These were the remains that the Soviets had been told were Hitler's. Many years later, Hussermann wrote in a book, "I took the dental bridge in my hand and looked for an unmistakable sign. I found it immediately. Took a deep breath and blurted out, 'These are the teeth of Adolf Hitler.' I was showered with expressions of gratitude. Yay! Or not yay. This was Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. Sincere gratitude was about as rare as Coca-Cola. She was thrown into solitary confinement and, in 1951, sent to a Siberian gulag. The reason why is that Stalin didn't want the Americans or the British to know someone had positively identified Hitler's remains. Having this information gave him leverage. The teeth would become very useful, but not until long after Stalin had died. Emaciated and sick, Hussermann almost died in the gulag, but in 1955 she was released when a deal was done with West Germany. She went home thinking people would be over the moon, only to find out her family had declared her dead and her husband had a new wife, all that pain just because she'd worked on Hitler's notoriously bad teeth. Month 6. Earlier, we mentioned that Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was arrested. He was convicted at the Nuremberg trials and would have died by hanging, but about 6 months after Hitler checked out with Eva, Göring was found dead in his prison cell. This happened on the night of the day that he'd been sentenced to death. Other Nazis were hunted down for many years, and some of them became old men on the run, notably the Angel of Death, Joseph Mengele. Many lower-ranking Nazis were imprisoned, such as Otto Gunsche, who you might remember was there when Hitler's body was burned. He died in 2003, age 86, and he always said that the cremation of Hitler did happen in that garden. He said he was the one that threw on the first flaming rag. Some folks didn't buy that. They still don't now. Month 7 to present day. Stalin, despite what he knew about the teeth, was still saying Hitler was alive, which many people still believed. Even the future US President Dwight D. Eisenhower repeated Stalin's words, although he later retracted them. Why Stalin kept saying this is not certain. Maybe he didn't believe the dentist. After all, she could have been lying, thinking a positive identity would help her. Or maybe Stalin was just stirring up trouble, confusing things, or maybe by saying that, his control over his people was enhanced. He wasn't making matters any easier when he refused to share his forensic evidence with the West. So about this time, a British historian named Hugh Trevor Roper was sent to investigate everything that happened in that bunker around the time of Hitler's supposed death. He compiled the dossier, And that's why we have the bonfire in the garden story that we're told today. It partly comes from this investigation. Even so, rumors persisted for decades. Writers later said such things as hundreds of FBI documents place Hitler in Argentina. This is also true. The CIA had a great big file regarding the hunt for Hitler. The agency later said it was more interested in who was interested in these stories rather than it thought Hitler was alive and well in Argentina and enjoying a daily fix of empanadas. The agency said it was merely surveilling people fond of Hitler. Only recently, forensic scientists went over to Russia and asked to look at those homeless teeth. They wrote in the European Journal of Internal Medicine that the gnashers of the nasty Nazi are real. In writing, the teeth are authentic, there's no possible doubt. Our study proves that Hitler died in 1945. Nonetheless, when other scientists recently inspected the separate skull the Russians had in the museum that was said to be Hitler's, they said it actually belonged to a woman likely in her 40s when she died. As for that photo we told you about at the start, the CIA said it just wasn't worth looking into, stating that enormous efforts could be expended on this matter with the remote possibility of establishing anything concrete. So, almost 80 years after his death, we can say Hitler very likely, almost definitely bit the dust in the bunker and subsequently got grilled in the garden. But the fact is, we can never be 100% sure. He would be 134 years old today, so we reckon we're not going to hear from him anytime soon. Now, you need to watch this amazing tale about Hitler's nephew, why Hitler's nephew was his worst enemy, or have a look at Hitler's plans for the world if he won.